We're done with chapter 1. Let's now move to chapter 2. With chapter 1 completed, the researcher has established the need for the study. Chapter 2 answers a different question. What has the scholarly community already discovered about this problem? Many beginning researchers misunderstand the purpose of the literature review. They believe that chapter 2 is simply a demonstration of extensive reading. The benchmark, the guidebook, makes it clear that this is incorrect. The literature review cannot simply be a summary of one book over the other. Ito na naman ako sa nahirapan na naman ako magpalaki ng text para makita nyo at mabasa nyo ng mas malinaw. So, it's not intended to summarize books one after another. Instead, it should organize existing scholarship into meaningful themes, compare competing positions, identify patterns and contradictions, and ultimately demonstrate why the present study is necessary. The thesis guide identifies three major components of chapter 2: review of related literature, synthesis and research gap, and conceptual framework. These three sections function together. The literature review identifies existing knowledge. The synthesis explains what remains unresolved. And the conceptual framework translates that unresolved problem into an analytical model guiding the methodology. One helpful way to understand chapter 2 is to think of it as joining an ongoing scholarly conversation. The researcher should not speak as though no one has studied the issue before. Instead, the researcher should ask or say, here is what previous scholars have established. Here are the points where they agree. Here are the questions they have not yet answered. And here is where the study contributes. Without this progression, the literature review becomes merely descriptive rather than analytical. The benchmark, therefore, emphasizes thematic organization, following the statement of the problem, scholarly synthesis, research gaps, and conceptual integration rather than isolated summaries or of authors. A strong chapter 2 convinces readers that the proposed research is not repeating existing work, but extending it. Let's look at some examples of very strongly written RRL. So, of course, we need to look at the benchmark, as we've said. Ayaw lumiit na. There. So let's look at the benchmark because there are technically four benchmark themes that we have to consider, right? Thematic organization, and we need to emphasize that over and over and over and over again, no? So why do we have to emphasize that over and over and over again? Precisely because many are still products of, or many advisors, if you will, are still products of old schools, no? So, what are old schools? Those that organizes everything according to literature types, or those that redo everything, or does everything according to local, international, to like that. So that is also something we still need to pay attention to, because we need to pay attention on how they are related to the statement of the problem. That's why we've always emphasized the outline of the specific questions is the one that defines the outline of the paper, no? And that's where it has to be very, very clear, in fact, no, very, very clear. And this is where I wanted you to recognize also the guidelines that is being provided in front of you. Another one is that there has to be a minimum reference of 20, that it should constitute a synthesis of texts, not simply an enumeration of texts, and a consistent APA format in text and reference list citation. So let's look at strong submissions, no? So based on that, let's look at the strong submissions, and we begin again with Panket's submission. So there are several submissions that demonstrate excellent organization of the literature. Panket's cognitive warfare manuscript is one of the strongest. Rather than presenting authors chronologically, Panket organizes the literature into coherent themes corresponding to the latter structure of the study. The discussion is divided into doctrine, organization, and training, and within each theme, the manuscript synthesizes international military scholarship, NATO publications, cognitive warfare literature, and organizational readiness frameworks. For example, Panket draws from NATO's Strategic Communication Center of Excellence publications, Claverie and Duclushel, White, Schall, Duchamp, Mustafaga, and Wenzel to explain why cognitive warfare requires institutional rather than merely technological responses. These organization accomplishes two important objectives. First, it prevents the chapter from becoming a list of disconnected summaries. Second, it directly prepares the conceptual framework and methodology. Readers immediately recognize why doctrine, organization, and training later becomes analytical dimensions. Another paper we're considering is Cruz Tababan's paper. No? The manuscript demonstrates remarkable doctrinal depth by organizing scholarship around bank secrecy, financial privacy, anti-money laundering, terrorism financing, statutory interpretation, Philippine legislation, and international financial standards. Rather than discussing these topics independently, the literature consistently returns to the central legal tension between financial confidentiality and national security. This is particularly effective because legal research often becomes fragmented across numerous statutes and cases. Cruz Tababan instead constructs a coherent narrative showing how these legal sources interact. A third example considering is Malate's paper that is structured is about risk classification in business permitting. The literature is organized around risk governance, collaborative governance, ISO 31000, ISO 9001 or 9001, regulatory harmonization, and ease of doing business. Again, notice that these are actually notice that these are themes rather than isolated authors. The literature review therefore functions as an argument rather than a bibliography. So, sorry for that. Somebody called me, so I have to pause a little bit. So, the literature review is an argument. That's what I can remember from before I pause it. And this illustrates that chapter 2 should synthesize scholarship rather than simply report it. Let's look at some common the common weaknesses that can still be developed, and we'll look at two papers all over again. So while several papers demonstrate strong thematic organization, others reveal common weaknesses that we should try to avoid. The first recurring problem is literature enumeration. Instead of organizing scholarship by concepts, some manuscripts simply summarize one author after another. The recurring structure often resembles these. Author A argues, author B argues, author C argues, author D argues. Although technically accurate, such writings does not explain how the authors relate to one another. Readers finish the chapter knowing what individual scholars wrote, but not what the scholarly conversation actually reveals. The second weakness is excessive historical background. Santos's AI manuscript illustrates this challenge. The literature discusses the history of artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, machine learning, cyber operations, and global military developments before sufficiently addressing AI use in Philippine local governance and information collection. The issue is not that these topics are irrelevant. Rather, they occupy disproportionate space relative to the actual focus of the research. The literature should instead be reorganized around themes directly connected to the research questions: AI in public governance, technology acceptance, information collection, operational readiness, organizational capability, and ethical governance. A third weakness concerns insufficient critical engagement. Researchers often quote authoritative authors without asking important analytical questions. For example, do these scholars agree? Where do they disagree? What assumptions do they share? Or what methodological limitations remain? Or which organizational contexts remain understudied? Without these questions, Chapter 2 becomes informative but not analytical. Finally, many literatures reviews stop at presenting previous studies or just address many themes. So the benchmark requires something more. The researcher must explain precisely why existing scholarship is insufficient and how the present study extends that leadership. Therefore, literature review should always move towards synthesis. The goal is not simply that many articles were read, but to demonstrate that after examining the literature carefully, one important question still remains unanswered, and that these theses is designed to answer it. Let's go to the next section, which is the synthesis and the research gap. Take note that we arrive at one of the most important, but unfortunately, one of the weakest sections in many graduate theses: the synthesis and the gaps. So many researchers believe that once they finish discussing the literature, they have completed chapter 2. The benchmark clearly disagrees with this. After reviewing the literature, the researcher must interpret it. This interpretation is the synthesis. From that synthesis emerges the research gap. So the distinction is important. A literature review asks, what have previous scholars written? A synthesis asks, after reading all these studies together, what do we now know? The research gap asks, after everything that has already been studied, what remains unanswered? This progression is what transforms chapter 2 from a bibliography into a scholarly argument. Scholarly argument. One of the strongest examples remains to be Panquet's manuscript. Rather than simply ending the literature review, Panquet explicitly identifies what international scholarship has accomplished and what it has failed to accomplish. The manuscript argues that existing studies successfully explain cognitive warfare, cognitive resilience, and institutional readiness, but they rarely provide localized empirical assessments of PAF Cognitive Management Group Readiness or CMOG. The literature is therefore theoretically rich but contextually incomplete. Notice how precise this gap is. The author is not claiming that nobody has studied cognitive warfare. Instead, the claim is much narrower. Nobody has systemically assessed readiness with this particular Philippine military unit. That is a defensible research gap. Another excellent example is Mangoba's paper. The study on livelihood insecurity among displaced informal settler families. The manuscript synthesizes previous work on relocation, livelihood, governance, and urban resettlement before identifying several persistent deficiencies. Among these are insufficient integration of governance and livelihood analysis, limited understanding of translocal governance, weak attention to political administrative coordination, mismatch between livelihood interventions and actual economic conditions, absence of integrated Philippine empirical studies. Notice again that the author is not merely saying there are few studies. Instead, the synthesis specifies what exactly previous studies failed to investigate. That is what reviewers expect. So, the general weakness of everybody is that nobody tried to synthesize the text. Uh, of course, you're encouraged to move towards four conclusions. What is already known, what remains uncertain, what previous studies overlooked, and how the present research addresses those omissions. If the researcher can clearly answer those four questions, more or less, they have written an effective synthesis and research gap. Take note too that while several submissions produce strong syntheses, many others reveal recurring weaknesses. The most common problem is the false research gap. Students often write statements such as there are no studies on this topic. This is rarely true. With contemporary scholarship available through Scopus, Web of Science, JSTOR, ProQuest, Google Scholar, and government databases, it is very difficult to argue that absolutely no studies exist. Instead, you should simply identify specific deficiencies. For example, no Philippine studies or no LGU level investigations, no military unit assessments, no qualitative exploration, no comparative governance framework, no integration of two existing concepts. These are defensible research gaps. Another weakness is failing to distinguish between a practical problem and a research gap. A practical problem exists in society. A research gap exists in scholarship. For example, cybersecurity threats constitute a practical problem. But if previous researchers have already extensively examined those threats, then cybersecurity itself is not a research gap. The research gap might instead concern Philippine implementation, organizational readiness, governance mechanisms, employee behavior, policy evaluation. Researchers must always ask what is missing from scholarship, not merely from society. A third weakness is presenting the gap as a conclusion without evidence. Researchers sometimes state that no studies exist without demonstrating that they have actually reviewed the literature. The synthesis should therefore function almost like a legal document. It should demonstrate this literature discusses X. It also explains Y. However, the studies consistently overlook Z. Therefore, the study investigates Z. So only then does the gap become persuasive. The benchmark expects precisely this logical movement because the research gap ultimately becomes the justification for the entire thesis. Now let's look at the conceptual framework, which is the third part of this lecture, of this chapter. Having identified the research gap, the next task is to explain how the study will examine that gap. This is the function of the conceptual framework. Many students think of conceptual framework simply as an IPOO. The benchmark defines it much more broadly. The conceptual framework should connect the research problem, the literature, the theoretical concepts, the methodology, and eventually the analysis. In other words, what are we saying here? No? In other words, the framework is not an illustration. It is the architecture of the research. Think of this one, the conceptual framework, as the bridge connecting chapter 2 and chapter 3. Without the bridge, the methodology appears disconnected from literature. One of the strongest frameworks worth pointing to is that of the Guzman study on quality assurance transparency for teacher-made learning resources. The conceptual framework begins with baseline QA conditions. It then proceeds to assessment of existing practices. These findings lead to the development of a tiered quality assurance tagging system. Finally, the framework identifies the expected governance outcomes: visible QA status, verifiable provenance, authorized sharing, improved transparency, enhanced transparency. Notice the logic. Each component naturally produces the next. Nothing appears decorative. The framework explains how evidence collected during the study eventually leads to institutional improvement. Pankett likewise presents a strong conceptual framework. Doctrine, organization, and training are not simply listed as independent variables. Instead, they operate together as mutually reinforcing institutional dimensions of readiness. Weak doctrine affects organization. Weak organization affects training. Weak training undermines doctrinal implementation. The framework, therefore, reflects the actual interaction among institutional components rather than treating them as isolated categories. This illustrates the essential characteristic of an effective conceptual framework. It explains relationships, not merely categories. But several manuscripts also illustrate common weaknesses in conceptual framework creation. The first weakness is a decorative IPO model. Students frequently produce attractive programs containing input, process, and output boxes connected by arrows. However, if the arrows do not represent actual theoretical relationships, the framework contributes very little to the study. A conceptual framework should be able to answer questions such as, why does organizational readiness influence implementation? Or why should institutionalization affect um, affect uh, participation? Or why should digitalization improve constituency services? Without these explanations, the diagram remains descriptive rather than analytical. Another common issue concerns conceptual competition. Santos's AI manuscript illustrates this challenge. The study discusses AI, information collection, technological acceptance, operational readiness, local government security. These concepts are individually important, but the framework must clearly explain how they relate. Does technological acceptance mediate operational readiness? Does AI improve information collection? Does organizational readiness influence AI adoption? The framework should make these relationships explicit. Similarly, Destriza's manuscript discusses both institutionalization and digitalization. The framework should clarify whether these are independent constructs, sequential processes, or dimensions of a larger governance model. Graduate researchers should remember one important principle. A conceptual framework is not judged by artistic appearance. It is judged by explanatory power. After viewing the framework, readers should immediately understand the important concepts, the relationships among those concepts, how those relationships guide data collection, and how they eventually answer the research questions. When these four elements are present, the framework has successfully fulfilled its purpose. In that case, it's a very strong conceptual framework. Let's move to chapter 3. No? The discussion in this review on chapter 2 is rather short, relatively short to chapter 1, but please take note, chapter 2 is considered the longest chapter in the proposal. So we now conclude chapter 2 and move toward chapter 3, methodology. At this point in the thesis, the researcher has already answered two fundamental questions. Chapter 1 answered, why is this study necessary? Chapter 2 answered, why does existing scholarship already tell us about this problem? And chapter 3 introduces a new question. How will this study produce trustworthy evidence? This transition is extremely important because methodology is not an independent chapter. It should emerge naturally from everything that preceded it. The problem statement determines the objectives. The objectives determine the literature. The literature produces the conceptual framework. The conceptual framework determines the methodology. This is why graduate research repeatedly emphasizes alignment. A researcher cannot simply decide to conduct interviews because interviews appear interesting. The chosen method must be justified by the research questions and conceptual framework. Similarly, thematic analysis, surveys, documentary analysis, or mixed methods must each demonstrate why they are appropriate for answering the specific problem identified in Chapter 1. We look at the guidebook, which requires that Chapter 3 explain and justify the research design, local, unit of the study, sampling, data collection, research instruments, data analysis, and APP matrix. I will discuss here in this recording until data analysis and will reserve action plan and project matrix for the next presentation. So as we now proceed into the next section of the presentation, we will now evaluate how effectively the manuscripts operationalize their research designs. We will examine whether the proposed methods genuinely answer the research questions or whether, despite having excellent topics and literature reviews, some studies still require stronger methodological alignment before they can be defended and performed or operationalized. This is often where a good proposal becomes an excellent thesis because rigorous methodology transforms interesting ideas into credible scholarly evidence. Let's look at the research design. We now begin chapter 3 with the first section, which is research design. So, if chapter 1 explains Why the study is necessary, and chapter 2 explains what scholars already know. Then the research design explains how the researcher intends to produce credible knowledge. The thesis guide emphasizes that the research design is not simply a label placed at the beginning of chapter 3. The researcher must explain why a particular design is appropriate for answering the research questions. Whether the study is qualitative, quantitative, mixed method, action research, doctrinal analysis, the design must emerge logically from the nature of the problem. A useful way to think about research design is to ask, if another researcher wanted to answer the same question, would this design allow them to do so systematically? One of the strongest examples in the class is the Guzman study on quality assurance transparency for teacher-made learning resources. The study adopts qualitative action research, and the choice is fully justified. The objective is not merely to describe existing QA practices, but to improve them through the development of a tiered quality assurance tagging system. The design, therefore, moves beyond observation toward institutional intervention. The manuscript explains that evidence will be generated through document review, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and iterative validation before the proposed QA framework is finalized. Notice the alignment in the Guzman's paper. The problem concerns the transparency of quality assurance. The literature discusses governance, instructional quality, and educational accountability. The framework proposes a QA tagging system. The methodology, therefore, adopts action research because the intended outcome is organizational improvement. This is a good example of methodological coherence. Another example is that of Barateta. OSG LRAI manuscript on AI governance. Instead of forcing a survey design, the study correctly employs documentary analysis supported by structured coding matrices and governance alignment assessment. The unit of analysis is not public opinion, but institutional policy. Consequently, the design evaluates documentary evidence against the Supreme Court's human-centered AI governance framework. This is an important methodological lesson. Researchers should never select a design simply because it is familiar. The design must correspond to the nature of the evidence required. A legal or policy study may legitimately rely on documentary analysis. An institutional reform study may appropriately employ action research. A governance implementation study may require qualitative interviews and document review. The key principle is always methodological fitness. Let's move forward. The next sections identify where the study takes place, locale of the study, and what exactly constitutes the unit being investigated, unit of the study. Many students underestimate these sections because they appear straightforward. However, reviewers discover conceptual weaknesses here also. The locale is more than the physical location. It explains why the location is appropriate for answering the research problem. The unit of the study is not merely the respondents. It identifies the primary object of investigation. The benchmark, therefore, expects researchers to justify both the research site and the unit under study. Maps are recommended whenever it is appropriate. Let's look at a strong example is Laride's Visitor Management System Study. The locale is clearly identified as Philippine Science High School Western Visayas Campus, supported by a location map and institutional documentation. This immediately situates the reader within the organizational context where visitor management procedures operate. The unit of the study likewise remains clear. The research is not about schools in general. It is about visitor management governance within one specific institutional environment. But with Laride, we can consider Guzman also. But let's jump a little bit to the unit of the study, which basically emphasizes and focuses on who the paper will focus on. Here we see for the unit of the study, Olfindo's study on space governance. The unit of the study is not satellites or space tech. Rather, it is interagency collaboration governing Philippine space activities. This distinction is important because the evidence collected concerns institutional coordination rather than technological capability. Similar studies like Gumarit study demonstrates conceptual clarity. The unit of this analysis is not youth in general, but the institutionalization of local youth development offices and their relationship with youth participation within local government structures. Some manuscripts, of course, require refinement. Testado's cybersecurity study must clarify whether it's interested with a BPO organization, cybersecurity personnel, ordinary employees, organizational cybersecurity capability, or organizational cyber capability itself. Each possibility would require different respondents, different instruments, and different analytical strategies. Likewise, Santos must clarify exactly which LGU security personnel constitutes the study population. Graduate researchers should remember this principle. The more precisely the unit of study is defined, the easier it becomes to justify sampling, instruments, and analysis. The more undefined they are, the more difficult, in fact, to process. Sampling design. Sampling design is often treated as a purely technical section, yet it has major implications for research credibility. Sampling answers one central question: why are these respondents the appropriate sources of evidence? And the benchmark requires researchers to identify both the sampling strategy and the basis for determining the sample. Whether probability or non-probability sampling is involved, the rationale must be explained. In, in qualitative studies, the emphasis is not statistical representativeness, but information richness. Participants are selected because they possess experiences, expertise, or institutional knowledge directly relevant to the problem. Destriza's study is interesting because it illustrates thoughtful sampling. The manuscript establishes inclusion and exclusion criteria so that only congressional offices directly engaged in constituency service delivery become part of the investigation. Offices performing exclusively legislative or committee functions are excluded. This protects the conceptual integrity of the study because the data will correspond directly to the research objectives. Similarly, Panquet's manuscript demonstrates careful respondent selection. Key informants include commanders, operational personnel, doctrine officers, training officials whose institutional responsibilities correspond directly to the readiness dimension under investigation. Because doctrine, organization, and training form the conceptual framework, the respondents are selected specifically for their ability to provide evidence concerning those dimensions. Several submissions require stronger justification. Some manuscripts simply state that purposive sampling will be used. However, purposive sampling is not itself a justification. Researchers must explain why these individuals possess the information necessary to answer the questions. Another common weakness is the absence of a sampling logic connecting respondents to the questions. So, when every objective has an identifiable evidence source, the sampling design becomes much more convincing. Let's go to data collection procedure and research instrument. Technically, I will address the two together. Once respondents have been identified, the researcher must explain how information will actually be collected. This often distinguishes an excellent thesis from an average one. The benchmark expects researchers to describe permissions obtained, ethical procedures, sequence of data collection, administration of instruments, management of records, and possible challenges encountered during fieldwork. Equally important, so equally important and quite related to this one is the discussion on research instruments that we've said. They're actually together most of the time. A questionnaire, interview guide, focus group protocol, documentary checklist, observation schedule should not merely be attached as an appendix. The researcher must explain why was this instrument developed? How does it correspond to the objectives? How will it generate valid evidence? Laride's manuscript demonstrates exemplary preparation. The appendices will include structured survey questionnaire, key informant interview guide, focus group discussion guide, document analysis checklist, observation checklist, institutional partner letter, acceptance letter, and proposed action plan. This tells reviewers that the study is operationally ready. Similarly, De Guzman's study includes a questionnaire, KI guide, FGD guide, document review checklist, informed consent forms, and institutional documentations. This instrument corresponded directly to the conceptual framework developed earlier. Several manuscripts, however, present only generic descriptions, such as the researcher will conduct interviews. This is insufficient. Graduate research requires evidence that the interview questions actually address the research objectives. That's the reason why we've always pushed for the CDI, concept, dimensions, indicators, alignment. Likewise, Testnado's manuscript appears to have incomplete appendices in the front matter, and this weakens methodological readiness because reviewers cannot determine whether the proposed instruments have already been developed. Researchers should remember that instruments should operationalize concepts. Without well-designed instruments, even an excellent conceptual framework cannot generate trustworthy findings. Let's look at data analysis. The final methodological component concerns how evidence will be interpreted. The action plan, which I will separate intentionally, will talk about how the research will contribute to institutional improvement. Data collection alone does not constitute research. Evidence must be analyzed systematically. The guidebook requires that the chosen analytical procedure correspond directly to the research design, the type of research of evidence collected, and the research questions being answered. It needs to follow a one-to-one alignment with the research questions. Barateta's manuscript provides one of the strongest examples. Rather than simply reading institutional documents, the study develops operational definitions, coding matrices, governance principles, alignment criteria, and pattern analysis. Each AI governance principle, such as accountability, transparency, fairness, data governance, explainability, and security, is examined against institutional evidence before determining levels of alignment and identifying governance gaps. Olfindo's study likewise employs a sophisticated analytical strategy. Institutional evidence is interpreted through ILO analysis, .mplfp, thematic coding, comparative document analysis, cross-case pattern matching, and triangulation. But please take note, don't just list them down. Don't just list them down. Do your best to actually do this one per statement of the problem. It has to be per statement of the problem. And that is the one that will strengthen this part of your paper. The APP, we have also Barateta, Destrita, and Laride, but we will try to look at that in a bit. No? So just take note of the other reviews. There are more there that you can see. It's not finished, but something to pay attention to. I will identify the 5 most common weaknesses here for you to pay attention to it. The benchmark protocol that you can ask to clarify also. And here we are. No? Let me allow myself to close. So the strongest, and as we conclude chapter 3, one overarching observation becomes evident. The strongest manuscripts are not necessarily those with the most ambitious topics. They are the ones whose problem statement, literature review, conceptual framework, methodology, instruments, analysis, and action plan all point toward the same research purpose. That alignment is the hallmark of a defensible paper. So when every chapter supports every other chapter, the thesis ceases to be a collection of independent requirements and becomes a coherent scholarly investigation capable of generating credible knowledge and meaningful institutional change. So, to close, so some common revision priorities first that I think you should implement. So the first recurring issue is the background sections that remain broad for too long. Many studies begin with extensive international discussions, but delay the presentation of the actual institutional problem. Researchers should remember that every paragraph in the background should move one step closer to the study itself. Second, several literature reviews enumerate rather than synthesize. Graduate research requires interpretation. The literature should compare ideas, identify patterns, expose contradictions, and build toward a research gap. Third, conceptual frameworks often function as illustrations instead of analytical models. A diagram becomes meaningful only when it explains why the principal concepts are related and how those relationships guide the methodology. Fourth, sampling designs frequently lack sufficient justification. Researchers should explain not merely who participates, but why those respondents are the most appropriate sources of evidence. Fifth, research instruments sometimes remain underdeveloped. Interview guides, document analysis matrices, observation protocols, coding manuals, and validation procedures should all be available before the final defense. Finally, action plans require stronger linkage with anticipated findings. And I will repeat that. Action plans require stronger linkage with anticipated findings. Recommendations should emerge naturally from the evidence rather than appearing as generic institutional improvements. Despite this observation, the evaluation for this class remains to be positive. Most revisions concerns organization and alignment, not the intrinsic value of the research topics. This is encouraging because structural improvements are generally easier to accomplish than conceptual reinvention. So take note of that also. Tap yourself because you've also did well. So again, don't forget, I've said the major strength of the class is topic selection. That's just amazing for you. Second, you demonstrate an encouraging commitment to institutional research, also very good. And third, that many submissions already exhibit very strong methodological awareness. Fourth, that hopefully we will demonstrate an increasing appreciation for action plans and project matrices. Okay? That too is very important. Uh, so now that we have said what needs to be said, no? Now that we have said what needs to be said, and I hope I was able to say what needs to be said indeed. So let's now close this first part of the two-part presentation for this morning, as I will exclude the APP later, because the APP has an anticipation of future outcomes also. So as we conclude this review, allow me to leave you not with another checklist, but with the reflection on what a master's thesis ultimately represents. Over the course of this evaluation, I have examined your manuscripts against common benchmarks. And I think that's obvious. From the formulation of the problem, to the construction of the literature review, to the design of your methodology. We have recognized exemplary work, identified recurring weaknesses, and proposed concrete ways for revision. Yet beneath all this technical consideration lies a more fundamental purpose. A master's thesis is not simply an academic requirement that must be completed to earn a degree. It is the first sustained demonstration that you can think like a scholar and act like a public administrator. It asks whether you can identify a genuine institutional problem, distinguish evidence from opinion, engage critically with existing scholarship, and produce recommendations that are both intellectually defensible and practically useful. That is why the standard we have repeatedly emphasized throughout the presentation is alignment. A strong thesis is one in which Chapter 1 defines the right problem, Chapter 2 explains why that problem still deserves investigation, Chapter 3 demonstrates that the chosen methodology is capable of answering the question. When these three chapters are coherent, the remaining chapters almost write themselves because the logic of the study has already been established. Looking across your class, I am genuinely encouraged. Your topics are not trivial. You are studying cybersecurity, cognitive warfare, educational governance, youth participation, financial regulation, digital transformation, space governance, institutional accountability, livelihood security, and organizational reform. These are not merely classroom exercises. These are questions that matter to public institutions and ultimately to the people they serve. The challenge now is not to change your topic. The challenge is to strengthen your scholarship, revise your backgrounds until they naturally lead to your research gap, rewrite your literature reviews until they become arguments rather than collection of summaries, refine your conceptual frameworks until every box explains a relationship rather than a decorative page. Strengthen your methodology until another researcher could replicate your study with confidence, and ensure that every recommendation is earned by evidence rather than assumption. Remember, no excellent thesis emerges in its first draft. Every publishable manuscript has been revised repeatedly. Every successful proposal is preceded by careful rewriting, difficult criticism, and thoughtful reflection. Revision is therefore not a sign that your work is inadequate. Revision is the process by which scholarship matures. Allow me to end with one final thought. The value of your thesis will never be measured solely by the number of pages you write, the number of citations you include, or even the grade you ultimately receive. Its true value will be measured by a much simpler question. Did this research help us understand an important problem more clearly than we understood it before? Did this research help us understand an important problem more clearly than we understand it before? If the answer is yes, then your thesis has already contributed something meaningful, not only to your degree, but to your profession, your institution, and the continuing development of public administration. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your commitment for rigorous research. And I wish that you continuously refine your work toward a strong, defensible, and impactful master's thesis. Thank you very much. And we'll just go on lunch break, and I'll see you this afternoon again for another lecture.